E na mana, e na reo, e rauranga tirama, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ni hao. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Fran, for that introduction. If you think you were exhausted at the end of the China trip, I don't think I've ever stood quite so focused, witnessing so many different things being signed in my entire life. But it was a great trip, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to be here with you this morning to speak at the China-New Zealand Summit at such a busy hour. Can I acknowledge all of the VIP and distinguished guests in the room? I won't turn this into an Emmy Awards speech and try and list you all off. There are plenty of you. It's great to have you all joining us. As you know, this is my first time giving a speech to this particular forum. And what you're going to hear from me today, though, is a continuation of the position that our country has taken for a number of years. My approach in the international sphere is not all that dissimilar to the priorities that I have here at home, getting back to the basics and dealing with the bread and butter issues that are in front of us. In foreign policy terms, that means making sure that we've got greater resilience across our trade markets at a time of particular global uncertainty. The longer I've been in this role, the more I've seen firsthand the enormous benefits that our country's independent foreign policy, our international role as an honest broker, and the importance of our close relationships in our prosperity and our security as a country. For several years, the China-New Zealand Business Summit has provided a really important platform for government, for business, for leaders, and for academia to come together. It's been an opportunity to share perspectives, discuss the landscape for New Zealand businesses in China, and help navigate an increasingly complex, dynamic, and shifting international environment. Just last year, both New Zealand and China's borders were still closed as a result of the COVID-19 global pandemic that wrought so much disruption and devastation. That sort of situation would have been absolutely unimaginable only a few years before that. During the pandemic, it wasn't possible to engage face-to-face, and we certainly suffered from that. Necessary those restrictions were, there's no doubt that they came at a hefty price, and in some cases we're still paying that price now. So it's great to see politicians, officials, business leaders, students, tourists, again travelling in both directions, reconnecting and re-engaging with one another. I'm, of course, one of those, and today I wanted to share a few reflections on the trade mission that I led to China just 3 weeks ago. Our delegation included New Zealand's top businesses and exporters, representatives of our tourism industries, our tech sector, our education providers, as well as the brilliant Te Matatini champions, Te Whānau Apanui, who represented New Zealand so well. The government's made a number of trade missions in the post-COVID-19 period of this nature, including to Singapore, Japan, Vietnam, the United States, and Australia. Although I've only been in this role a short time, I have been focused on playing my part in strengthening and enhancing the range of existing relationships that New Zealand holds so that we can advance our trading opportunities. It reflects my strong determination that New Zealand as a trading nation needs to continue to drive a wide range of offshore opportunities that are going to support our economic resilience and our recovery from one of the greatest global shocks the world has experienced since the last great pandemic. It's why our government's been so focused on driving an active free trade agreement agenda to open as many doors as possible for New Zealand businesses and exporters. It was natural, therefore, that China's post-COVID-19 reopening earlier this year prompted us to lead one of our first very large trade missions to New Zealand's largest offshore market. The New Zealand export story to China is well known. It's a phenomenal success story, propelled by our 2008 free trade agreement that took two-way trade from around $8 billion a year to more than $40 billion a year today. Today, our top exports are To China are dairy, meat and forestry. But the New Zealand story that I witnessed when I was in China a few weeks ago was much broader than just container ships and commodity-based trade. Although that does continue to play a very valued and a fundamental role, it was also a story of innovation, adaptation, and cutting-edge technology. I witnessed New Zealand companies working to provide their groundbreaking climate and environmental solutions that are helping to drive change in China. I saw Kiwi firms focused on delivering high-quality, safe, nutritious food for babies and children, and others bringing their health and wellness products into one of the world's largest consumer markets. Others were operating entirely in the digital sphere. And I was able to speak with Kiwi companies who've made significant investments in their own China operations, from manufacturing through to things like Fonterra's innovation centres. A key focus for me was on supporting New Zealanders' businesses across the board to reconnect with their existing partners, after a period in which the distance that we have from New Zealand and the rest of the world truly felt like an even bigger one. I was able to support our international education and tourism sectors as they welcome back Chinese students and tourists after the years caused by COVID-19. A few reflections. The first is that New Zealand has built up sizable economic interests in China, and that's an economic reality and one that I don't need to explain to everybody in the room. In large part, that's due to a lot of hard work by many of the people in the room over a number of years. The second is that it's the government's job, and one that I take extremely seriously, to work alongside our businesses and our exporters to ensure that we continue to have a stable and positive economic relationship, even as we navigate a more complex regional and global landscape. Third, the visit to China needs to be seen alongside the government's commitment to provide exporters with a range of options. China is an incredibly attractive market, but the finalisation of our free trade agreements with the UK, the European Union and the CPTPP all provide our exporters with more favourable terms of trade than before in a wide range of other equally significant and equally high-value markets. The 7 new or upgraded free trade agreements that we've signed since 2017 have seen goods covered by tariff-free free trade agreements rise from 52% of exports to almost 3/4. The opportunities out there abound for our exporters at the moment. New Zealand has an evolving and multifaceted relationship with China, and the implications of China's rise for us, our region, and the globe should be acknowledged. China's economic growth has brought about a remarkable transformation of its society over the last 40 years. In this time, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China, and it's been for many countries around the world the similar story. China's rapid growth has also been a driver of New Zealand's own prosperity. Where they have gained, so have we. But the change isn't limited to economic growth. As China's economic influence has grown, the Chinese government has also become more assertive in its own foreign policy. In its own words, China has stood up and is now asserting its interests globally. It's normal for states to pursue their interests and to use all tools at their disposal to exert influence regionally and internationally. But as I've noted recently, China's rise and how it seeks to exert that influence is also a major driver of the increasing strategic competition, particularly in our wider home region, the Indo-Pacific. Our region is becoming more contested, less predictable, and in some cases, less secure. That poses challenges for small countries like New Zealand that are reliant on the stability and the predictability of international rules for our prosperity and security. In this increasingly complex global environment, our relationship with China will continue to require careful and thoughtful management. New Zealand's been a firm and consistent partner in our commitment to our One China policy, and more recently in our implementation of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. My sense from my visit 3 weeks ago is that our relationship between the countries is in good shape. I evidenced a very warm reception that I received, and we achieved quite a broad range of outcomes during the visit, busy though it was. In engaging with China's leadership, I made the point that in this relationship, we'll continue to talk candidly, but respectfully, about the issues on which we differ, the same way in which we would with any other country. Face-to-face engagement is a critical part of New Zealand's diplomacy. In this complex global environment, dialogue and engagement are more important than ever. The government has been very busy in that regard. In addition to my own meetings with the Chinese leadership in Beijing last month, Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta travelled to China to meet with her counterpart, Foreign Minister Qin Gang, back in March. And we've had meetings between our defence, trade, agriculture, forestry, science and tourism ministers. Underpinning all of that high-level engagement are a range of senior officials' dialogues, providing an important platform for regular exchanges on a broad range of topics. The conversations that we have aren't always easy, but they are essential. It's important that we continue to engage with China, to listen, to build dialogue, to pursue New Zealand's interests, and to add our distinctive identity and voice where it matters. There are 3 key principles that I think will continue to guide our relationship with China. First, we'll continue to engage with China and cooperate in areas where our interests converge. Second, we'll act always to preserve, protect and promote our national interests and values. And 3, we'll work with partners to advocate for approaches that represent our interests and values. And across all of those areas, we'll engage with China consistently, predictably and respectfully. New Zealand will always maintain an independent foreign policy, guided by a clear focus on our essential and enduring interests and the values that we hold. That means that we will place high value on engagement and dialogue with China. We'll also look to cooperate with China in areas where it's in our interests to do so. For example, on trade and economic issues, and working together to tackle some major global challenges, including climate change and environmental protection. We can never forget that New Zealand's a small and open country whose prosperity is inherently tied to trade. China's a vital and significant trading partner with a market of 1.4 billion consumers, buying around $20 billion worth of New Zealand goods every year. It's also currently New Zealand's 3rd largest market by value for services exports, currently worth $1.2 billion a year. At the same time, we need to be eyes wide open. Market concentration contains a degree of risk. We improve resilience when our businesses have access to a wide range of markets. Then the New Zealand government has continued to work hard on this alongside the business community. Other areas of bilateral cooperation include environmental protection and climate change, and on these we've got a wide range of dialogues, including on green finance and forestry and emissions trading schemes, as well as regular ministerial dialogue. One outcome from my first visit was an agreement to step up policy engagement on e-vehicles, for example. China is a very important supply market for e-vehicles for New Zealand consumers as we look to make the transition to being a low-carbon economy. During my visit, I heard firsthand from businesses that our sustainability credentials and our environmentally friendly products are driving consumer sentiment at great pace in the Chinese market. This wasn't just in China. Travelling around Europe as well, I saw firsthand how important that clean green brand and image is to our export success. Consumers around the world are increasingly becoming far more discerning at the supermarket in terms of looking for goods that have a sustainable backstory. And New Zealand must continue to be at the forefront of that if we are going to overcome all sorts of other barriers to being able to sell our goods abroad. We also valued China's leadership in presiding over the adoption of the global biodiversity framework, setting new global goals and targets to halt and reduce biodiversity loss by 2030. We must also remember that New Zealand and China have different histories, geographies, political systems and cultures. It's therefore expected that we'll have different perspectives on a range of different issues. Which brings me to the next issue that I mentioned. New Zealand always will be consistent, predictable and respectful in addressing any differences that we have. But make no mistake, we will always act to preserve, promote and protect our interests where those are being challenged, whether nationally, regionally or globally. As a small country, we see the rules-based international order based around key organisations like the United Nations and the World Trade Organisation as critical to those interests. Both New Zealand and China have benefited greatly from the global rules and norms that have underpinned our security and prosperity for decades. But this system is increasingly being challenged. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, in breach of fundamental tenets of the UN's Charter, is an example of the concerning trend that we're seeing. So we look to China to play a constructive role, reflecting its growing influence in the world. China is, for example, an important global player on climate change, both as a major emitter and because China is crucial to global and national solutions. This is true too for the role China can play in achieving nuclear disarmament. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, China also has responsibilities. That's why we've encouraged China, consistent with its commitment to the UN Charter, to use its access and influence to urge Russia to abide by its international obligations. For Russia to cease military operations in Ukraine, to withdraw its troops, and to return to diplomatic negotiations as a pathway to end the war and to resolve the conflict. We'll continue to advocate this position at every level of China's leadership because it's an important issue to our values as a sovereign nation. New Zealand also has a deep interest in a peaceful and stable Indo-Pacific region. As a trade-dependent nation, with nearly half our trade passing through the South China Sea, continued unimpeded access to shipping and air routes is vital. New Zealand is concerned about the worsening strategic environment and rising tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, in particular in places like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. We have direct interests in these areas, and therefore we need to be focused on the need for tensions to be carefully managed and de-escalated in the wider interests of the whole of the region. And we look to China to play a role in that regard. I made all of these points during the discussions that I had in China. And in advancing our interests offshore, we can't forget that New Zealand's security begins at home. To that end, the government will be releasing an interrelated set of strategic policy documents and assessments spanning across New Zealand's national security, our defence and our foreign policy, including New Zealand's first national security strategy. Taken together, these represent an important step in how we will protect our national interests and advance our national interests in a more contested and difficult world. But at the same time, we need to move forward collectively with quiet confidence about who we are as a country and what it is that we stand for in the world. A small country like New Zealand cannot work alone, and we recognise the importance of building partnerships and of inclusivity in addressing global challenges. New Zealand has a long and proud independent foreign policy. As Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta has said recently, an independent foreign policy doesn't mean isolation, neutrality, or a fixed predetermined view of how we will act on every particular issue. and nor does it mean going it alone. It's clear that in this complex and interconnected world, one where New Zealand's geographical remoteness will not shield us, charting a way through many of the most pressing regional and global issues is going to require working together with others. Where we share a common view with our partners, we'll act to protect and preserve what's important to us. That's New Zealand's approach will often align with many of our most like-minded partners with whom we share so many common interests and values won't come as a surprise. Countries like the United States, United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan and others have so much history and values in common with New Zealand. Australia in particular is New Zealand's only ally and it's our closest partner. It's natural that we'll often have a similar perspective on the sharpening geostrategic environment. These common interests and concerns don't mean that we will always take exactly the same approach, though. Sometimes there's tactical strength and diversity of approaches to achieve the same outcomes. But our shared liberal democratic values, our respect for human rights and for the international rules means that we've joined partners like Australia, the United States and others to raise concerns about a range of issues, for example, the human rights situation in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. We've also joined like-minded partners like Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam and others in Southeast Asia calling for legal and diplomatic frameworks to be the focus for resolving territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And we're stepping up our engagement with India as it expands its role and interests in the Indo-Pacific.
Interesting in the 88-day countdown to another special date, October 14, to see that played out, Prime Minister. Anyway, just looking at some of the questions from the floor, is China in the wait list to join CPTPP from a New Zealand perspective?
As perspectives are shared with others, we'll work together because that is at the heart of an independent foreign policy. So to conclude, thank you for the opportunity to share a few reflections today, and let me finish with another reflection from my visit to China. I had the pleasure of visiting the Baoshan International Folk Art Museum, where since in 2010, museum staff have been the careful guardians of Te Waharoa. Te Waharoa is a beautiful carved entranceway, which was created on the New Zealand Pavilion at the time of the Shanghai Expo. And it was gifted to the people of China to symbolise the ongoing cultural, business and political connections between our two countries. The kauri wood that was used to carve Te Waharoa is 3,500 years old, and it came from the ancient forests here in Aotearoa. As I expressed my thanks to the people of Baoshan for their guardianship of this important taonga, and as I stand here today with you, I'm reminded of the great respect that both countries have for the long histories, rich cultures, and strong people-to-people connections that bind New Zealand and China together. As with any complex relationship, there are areas where we cooperate to advance our shared interests, and there are areas where we disagree. It's how we deal with difference that's important, and it won't always be easy. But for our part, we'll seek to manage these with respect, with care, and with the responsibility they deserve, in line with a clear sense of our national interests and values, because that is the New Zealand way. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
I think we have time for the audience for one or two questions via Slido. While I'm waiting for the Slido screen to come up, Prime Minister, I think you were described a few months ago, or certainly before you headed to China, as a foreign affairs rookie. How do you see your progress as an experienced diplomat now?
Well, far be it from me to judge my own performance, but okay.
Go ahead.
Look, I think the last few months have provided a huge range of opportunities for us. When I think about my visit to the UK for the King's coronation, we were able to get an implementation into force of the UK Free Trade Agreement. The visit to China, we were able to open so many doors and actually see the business-to-business relationships advanced. And then the recent visit to Brussels, where we were able to sign the European Union Free Trade Agreement. I think if you judge my international travel based on outcomes, I think we're doing okay. Like any job, being Prime Minister poses a whole range of different challenges to any other job anyone could have, and some of them you learn as you're going along, and you get better as you're going along. But I think on the outcomes, front, what we've been able to achieve internationally in the last 6 months tells a pretty good story.
I think that'll be interesting in the 88-day countdown to another special date, October 14, to see that played out, Prime Minister. Anyway, just looking at some of the questions from the floor, is China in the wait list to join CPTPP from a New Zealand perspective?
As the current chair of the CPTPP, New Zealand welcomes all of the international interest that there is in joining that agreement, including from China. The CPTPP sets a pretty high threshold for countries to accede to it. The UK have just completed that process. And any other country that wants to join the CPTPP will need to go through that process as well. So they will need to make sure they meet the very high thresholds and match the criteria. And then there's a consensus building process around that. So I guess in our role as chair, we're welcoming all of the increased international interest that there is in joining. And we'll see the process through in a fair and consistent manner for any of the countries that want to join.
Mm-hmm. One question, again from Frankie Wong, Morena Prime Minister, what was the biggest surprise when you were in China, culturally, economically, and people-to-people exchange?
I don't think it would necessarily be surprise, but I took huge heart from the fact that the people-to-people connections are actually still in very good heart, given the 2 or 3 year absence that has existed in many cases. So even when people weren't able to travel and meet in person, there was clearly still a lot of engagement going on. The fact that our exports to China continued to grow when we weren't able to visit, I think is a testament to many of the people in the room who clearly found other ways of doing business with China during that time. So probably that was a clear observation. The relationships continued to flourish even with the COVID-19 restrictions that have been in place on both sides over the last few years. Probably the thing that always gives me a bit of a buzz, though, is things like a visit to a supermarket where you just see so many New Zealand products, sitting on the shelf. There's just nothing that quite replicates for that. You get that little sense of pride in New Zealand when you're walking around a Chinese supermarket and you see just how well our exporters are doing there and how well valued New Zealand produce and products are there.
Mm-hmm. And a question from Brett O'Reilly. What's the decarbonisation opportunities with China that you would have perceived while you were in China?
There's no doubt China's going to be one of the major drivers of some of the technology that we are going to need globally around decarbonisation. And so that ongoing dialogue and that ongoing partnership is so critically important. We've got some amazing researchers at the forefront of some of that work here in New Zealand, but we're going to need to work with countries with scale if we're going to capture some of the work that they're doing, some of the insights they're doing, and scale them rapidly, because it is a rapid challenge. When we get a new breakthrough or a new innovation around new ways of dealing with carbon and new ways of dealing with the climate change challenge, we simply can't afford to take our time with it. We need to actually make sure we're moving at pace. I heard a phrase on the plane back, which I hadn't heard before when speaking about this. A lot of New Zealand businesses talk about moving at China speed. And I hadn't heard that phrase until now, but they're absolutely right. China moves faster than most other economies in taking an idea from being an idea to fruition. And there's lessons that we can learn from some of that as well.
And several anonymous questions, but we'll just look at new opportunities post-COVID. You talked before about EVs and other issues. Was there anything that really surprised you when you went, aha, that might be something we can go for, or where we have expertise?
I think health and well-being in a market that is increasingly expanding a middle-class range of consumers. China's goal is to double its middle class by 2035. Health and well-being is going to become an increasing market. And that doesn't just mean health and well-being products, it means health and well-being services as well. So we had Les Mills with us on the trip, where they just see such huge opportunity there. And there are going to be opportunities for other New Zealand businesses in that space. that's an international market that is simply exploding at the moment, and New Zealand's got some really good product offerings there that might not be physical goods and services, well, physical goods, but they're certainly services that are going to be very attractive to an increasing range of international consumers, and we saw plenty of them in China.
One last question, sorry people, from Stephen Jacoby. China's a big country that works on big ideas. What's the big new idea that can take this relationship forward?
Not all big ideas need to be new ideas. I think the big concept that works so well for New Zealand in China is to be a trusted partner that's continuing to be at the forefront of the sustainability agenda. Because as the rest of the world grapples with the challenge of climate change, as we see more evidence of climate change, international consumers increasingly are becoming discerning around these issues. New Zealand must continue to do what we're doing now, to be at the forefront of that, because that is how we'll continue our access to international markets like China. If we don't have carbon neutrality in our packaging, in our labelling, in our underlying approaches to producing the goods the world wants to consume, they'll look elsewhere for those goods if other places are offering those things. Because we start with a head start, that doesn't mean we can afford to be complacent. I think we've got a great story to tell now, but the rest of the world is catching up. You know, we saw evidence of that in Europe. Just travelling internationally always just gives you such an insight, and by making things immediate that might otherwise seem a bit theoretical when you're home in New Zealand. Right the way across Europe, a big emerging market for us now with the European Union Free Trade Agreement coming on stream. Climate change is at the forefront of everything. So our ability to get into that market and to be successful in that market is going to continue to involve us having that really clean, green, sustainable backstory for our products. And so I think that's going to be critical to us continuing to grow and expand our market in China, as it's going to be around the rest of the world as well.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for a plain speaking but pragmatic and optimistic address.
Thanks, Fran.